not afraid anymore, Tula. The reckoning is still upon us, stalking us from the darkness. If the shadows are where they want to fight, then that is where I shall go.
We see if Valia is the monster her choices made her out to be, as we watch a different self-created reckoning that separates the Sisterhood in this episode, and we also say goodbye to some important characters, all while being left in the dark to an unknown enemy who's been scheming against the Sisterhood from the shadows, the same shadows that Valia thought she belonged to.
Oh, you think darkness is your ally?
It is time to recap and provide a scene-by-scene deep analysis into Dune Prophecy's Season 1 finale of Episode 6, titled The High-Handed Enemy. An episode that gave us a new meaning to Sisterhood Above All and answered some major questions set up throughout the season, but also sets up a recently announced Season 2. You're going to want to make sure to stick around to the end of this video, where I'll be sharing a theory about who's the mystery person that's responsible for creating Desmond Hart as a weapon. With that said, let's break down this almost feature-length sides episode, spoilers ahead. After discovering that Hart is her son, we open this finale with Tula hearing the four mothers criticizing her for abandoning her son, and they also tell her how she should never have listened to her sister. You know, it's interesting to think that the four mothers are talking to the Reverend Mothers, and I am very curious to know, since Tula and Valia are sisters, like which four mothers are speaking to which characters. Are they hearing the same thing from the same four mothers, or are some four mothers pushing against them to work against each other? I am just so fascinated by that whole concept. As we flash back to the night of Mother Superior Raquela's death, and we see a different perspective of the confrontation between Valia and Dorotea, as Tula, Francesca, and Kasha watch from afar. Now, as we know, Valia uses the voice on Dorotea, and Tula watches, and to me, she remembers the last time she saw her sister use the voice on their own mother. But unlike that last time where Valia stopped herself, we of course know what she did this time around as she proceeds to instruct Dorotea to take her own life. Now, we get the continuation of this scene from the premiere episode, where we see them asking in panic what they should do next, as Valia responds with Sisterhood Above All, which, after what we discover later in this episode, that now has a whole new meaning. We see Tula suggest that they walk away, but Francesca reminds them that they'll eventually get caught, as Kesha says that they should reveal the truth, which leads Valia to making up the story about Dorotea taking her own life because of her grandmother's recent passing, as they slowly begin to agree by adding to the story, except for Tula, who runs away. Now, Valia finds her sister throwing up and tells her that she had no choice because Dorotea threatened to destroy everything that Raquela had built, and essentially framing that as a tie to this new life that they have built with the Sisterhood. So Valia made the choice to act, and she said her hand was forced. As Tula responds by revealing her pregnancy, which explains why she was throwing up. Now, Valia asks if it's Ori Atreides' child and begins to think that maybe he forced himself on her sister, but Tula lets her know that it wasn't like that, as Valia asks if she wants to keep the kid, and Tula tells her yes. Now, despite her hate towards the Atreides, we see Valia says that she'll support her sister and they should raise the child together, even with the Sisterhood's policy against having separation between mother and child. Now, we watch as Valia looks her sister dead in the eye, and she tells her,
I told you, if you followed me here, I would protect you. This is our family now. Our, sisters above all.
Now, you'll notice Valia says to her sister, sisters above all. You notice a difference. There's no sisterhood this time around. Such an interesting moment for these two characters to me. Now, to me, Valia is half being truthful in this moment and wanting to support her sister Tula. Now, part of me feels like Valia said this in regards to supporting her sister because she doesn't want her sister to possibly let it out what happened to Dorotea, so she wants to prevent any confrontation between them. Now, another part of me says that she said all this in support of raising this child with her sister is to buy herself some time to see if the child could have any interest to her and, of course, the Sisterhood, and probably use the child as a tool later, which comes to light a little bit later in this episode. Now, we cut to present day, where Sister Nazir has returned and Tula shows her the students' drawings of their shared nightmares. Now, Nazir tries to understand the situation of how Kasha was able to survive days after being exposed to the virus versus the almost instant death from those at the Landsrat. Now, Tula mentions the exceptional mastery of Kasha with the Prana Bindu, which in the world of Dune is a demonstration of superior control over one's nerves and muscles. Now, the topic of fear is brought up in this conversation, which happens to be a key part of this episode, as we learn that Kasha at a very young age had the ability to live in the face of fear. Remember that for later. Now, this conversation sparks Nazir suggesting that the virus feeds off of fear. Now, she suggests that this is being used as a bioweapon, but the question remains, what is its connection to Desmond Hart, as she believes that Hart heart was not only a vessel for the virus, but it was also its first victim. Now, this section of the episode definitely reaffirms the idea of this series building to the concept behind one of the famous things of Dune is fear is the mind killer, and the events of Desmond Hart being the origins of that concept. Now, we'll be discussing something else that's synonymous to that a little bit later in this breakdown. Now, as we know, as Hart's mother, we see Tula suggest that they help him and use him to create a cure, similar to what Mother Raquel did in creating the raw sac poison. Now, since they've been exposed, they can transmute the virus as Tula volunteers, but Nazir wants to do it instead because of her qualifications as a medical examiner. She's also been exposed to the nightmare as well. We watch as they perform the transmutation and bond Nazir with the foreign agents. As it begins, Nazir notices something is wrong as the virus is reacting quickly to making the bond. Now we see the violent reaction beginning to happen, but Tula reminds her of her training as a sister, and for a moment she's in control, but immediately she's overtaken by its potency. As she begins to scream in agony, and she says that she sees the monster on Arrakis, followed by her seeing eyes, and that these same eyes are watching him. They're watching. Now, as she tries to fight this virus off, she says that it's not human, as the more she fights, the stronger the effects become, as we see her yelling out, and unfortunately she dies, as Tula watches and cries because yet another sister has been taken by this virus. This time around, it wasn't because of Hart directly. Now we cut to Hart as he's torturing Kieran for answers about the Sisterhood's involvement in the insurgents. Now Kieran assures to Hart that he had no idea about the Sisterhood's involvement, as he reconfirms the theory that Albert was or is his father. Again, the way he speaks about his father is always in past tense, which makes me think that his father is no longer around. But Kieran shares with Hart the bedtime story his father would share with him about a monster who lived amongst his people, of course referring to Tula, point of the story being that you should never trust a Harkonnen. Now Hart advises that he takes revenge for his fallen family members, but Kieran continues to stand his ground and refuses to testify against the Sisterhood because of his hatred towards Hart and the Emperor. Now, I need to know in the comments below, are you all thinking like me in that Albert Atreides may still be alive, or if Kieran might have any direct family members that are still alive, and we might meet them in Season 2. Now, cut to Kieran, who's now back in suspension, as we see Nez tries to release him, but is stopped by her mother. Now, Nez tries to convince her mother to let Kieran go, and calls back to their conversation from the first episode, and in return, she'll never see him again, but the Empress instead has her arrested as a lesson about power, as Nez is taken away. Now, this taking a moment to thinking about Nez and how this whole story is about broken families and how you can't choose your family. Just thinking about how Nez just recently lost the trust in her brother, her father, and now her mother. She really has no reason to believe that she's a part of that family anymore. And again, it almost shares a similar storyline to Valia in a way. Now we cut to the Emperor and Francesca, as it's confirmed in this moment that Constantine has indeed left to command his new fleet, as it is time for her to go back to her responsibilities, but the Emperor suggests that she stay with him at the palace. The Emperor tells her that the Empress is well aware of their relationship and he's tired of this pretend life that he's been living with her, as he requests to speak to the Mother Superior about how him and Francesca can now be together officially and publicly. Now, this gets interrupted by the news of Nez being recently arrested. Now, going back to that conversation, is it me or did it sound like he was maybe promised that him and Francesca would be together at some point by Valia? Again, this being another example of how much power and influence she had over him. Francesca shares what happened to Nez with Valia, and she knows that they must act quickly before something happens to her, especially around Hart. Now, it's here that Francesca realizes the message from the Emperor about her replacing the Empress as queen. Now, Valia immediately shuts down any conversation about this possibility as she calls Francesca naive. She basically explains how a move like that can put the whole Imperium on a course to war. Now, we briefly talked about this in last week's breakdown, but I do just find it so interesting to know that the Sisterhood has their different rules around motherhood, but also how they handle relationships with possible lovers. Again, it makes me think about the future where Leto and Lady Jessica couldn't get married, and I believe what happens later to Francesca and the Emperor set the precedent for the way that these romantic relationships between the sisters and the royal men leaders are somewhat forbidden, besides obviously giving birth being a part of the breeding process. Now, Valia tells her that the Emperor's time of ruling has met its expiration date, as Valia goes over the details of Theodosia with a plan to free the princess, and it's time to change tactics. Now, it's here where she tells Francesca that it's time to kill the Emperor, as Francesca says that he is the father of her son and doesn't outright say no, but it's clear that she's against this idea. Now again, with them being close friends, we see Valia tells her that she's sorry, but she knew that this day would eventually come. Now again, this reaffirms my feelings about how, yes, Francesca and maybe other sisters who are put in these positions, and going back to Lady Jessica that we saw in the films with Leto, their task with being in these romantic relationships are part of the Sisterhood's plans. But eventually, it seems like some of them actually fall in love, and that kind of makes sense. But unfortunately, once that particular male of power ever gets out of line or is deemed to be uncontrollable, the decision about their life coming to an end seems to be destined even without that particular sister's consent in the ultimate decision. As we saw what happened with Leto in the films, and later we see what happens to Haviko. Now it's here that we flash back to where Valia shows Tula, Kasha, and Francesca of Mother Raquela's life's work with the thinking machine's assistant in the breeding process. Now Tula sees this and is completely against this idea as she speaks of the horrific experience with humans versus AI, but Valia shows them just how powerful and valuable this system is, as they call it Anaru. Now, I don't know if this is a coincidence or if this is canon to the lore of Dune, but the name given to the machine happens to be the same name of a member of later called the Bene Gesserit, Lady Adarun Carino, who happens to be the mother of Princess Irulan Carino. As Valia demonstrates the machine's abilities to find in them the union that they need, this is where we see young Haviko and Natalia, who possesses the traits of producing a child that the sisterhood could mold into one of them, and that of course being Nez. Now funny enough, it's Francesca who brings up the unforeseen uncertainties about assuring this match, as we see the newly appointed Mother Superior Valia working her magic, and she's planting the idea of Francesca imprinting on him to set the path of having a sister on the throne as the Empress. Now again, Tula is showing signs of uncertainty, and this is where Valia has the other sisters leave for they can speak privately amongst themselves. Now this is where Valia shows her sister in this moment that the Atreides and the Harkonnens bloodlines have never crossed paths before until now, as she actually shows Tula her unborn son. Now again, Valia working her magic of words, she shares the incredible potential her unborn child will have, and he even has the ability to change the course of worlds, but he'll require the right amount of guidance to reach his full potential. I don't know, guys, does it sound like anyone you know from the future by the name of Paul Atreides? Now going back to that scene, it is just so fascinating to me just how much power a child born of both bloodlines, Harkonnens and Atreides, can be. Now I want to know from my book readers in the comments below, is there an explanation in the books to why crossing those bloodlines creates such a potential force that can either be a gift or a curse to the universe? Now yet again, we see just how perfect Valia is in influencing people, but specifically her siblings. We saw it with Griffin, and now we see it again with Tula. Now at the same time, she knows just how to make it appear like she's actually being a supportive sister at first, but from what we've seen from her in this show, we know that she also sees the potential of the soon-to-be nephew of hers and knows he can be a tool for the sisterhood, but more importantly, be a tool for Valia. But I do want to point out, it is in this scene that you can tell that Tula understands and sees through her sister's optimistic support, and she knows that she has to keep her child from her sister. Now cut back to present day, where Tula is speaking to Anaru about analyzing what Sister Nazir was referring to before she died. As we watch, Anaru suggest to Tula that this inhuman machine is working on a nanoscale. Now Tula is very adamant that her son wasn't born a weapon, but instead he was made into one, as she sets her sights on going to go see her son Desmond Hart for the first time since he was a little baby. Now back with the sisterhood, we see Sister Emmeline overhears that Mother Tula is gone, as we cut to seeing Jen and Lila. Now Lila awakes to restraints and requests that they get removed because of her time that she spent in the tank, and she also feels like she's being treated as a criminal. Now we watch as Lila puts on this innocent act to convince Jen to help her, which she does, as my theory comes to fruition as it's revealed that Lila is actually now being controlled by her grandmother Dorotea and uses the sedative that Tula gave her in the last episode to knock Jen out. Now quick side note, because it isn't mentioned in this episode, but something I hope is explored more in season 2 is the reveal of Lila's parents. And the reason I bring this up is because I think about Dorotea. She was so committed to the sisterhood, it makes me wonder, when was she have had time to, number one, have a child without it being a part of the plan that Raquel had with the whole breeding process? Like, it makes me think, was Lila a mistake from Dorotea's daughter? Again, was Dorotea's daughter in the sisterhood? Are Lila's parents even still alive? Again, I'm assuming that her mother, Lila's mother, was a part of the sisterhood, because if you all remember back, and I want to say in episode 2 or whatever the episode was when Lila took the agony, we had heard Tula say that she knew her mother. So I'm assuming that she was a part of the sisterhood, Sisterhood, but again, I hope that this is explored more and fleshed out more in season 2. Now from here we cut to seeing Sister Emmeline congregating with her followers as to their surprise we see Lila appears. Now it's here where Dorotea learns the coming reckoning to the Sisterhood, and again we get to see the brilliance on display from a performance standpoint by Chloe, who's just doing such a great job of mimicking the similar characteristics of the actress who played Dorotea. But I also really enjoyed the writing in this scene as Lila aka Dorotea return is being used as like a double meaning, where she says that her return is despite the efforts of others, as she's looking for Valia, who we know is her sworn enemy, as she learns that she is now referred to as Mother Superior Valia, as she also learns about the debanning of her previous followers after her suicide, which after hearing that, she knows that that's not true and that's not the cause of her death, which clearly upsets her. Now during all this, we cut to Jen, who's in panic mode, but for the first time, and correct me if I'm wrong, for the first time this season, we see her using the lessons of the Sisterhood as she concentrates and she puts herself through the pain and the fear, and she puts that aside as she breaks her thumbs to release herself. Now back with Dorotea, we see her gathering the files of the Mentat sisters to find the location of her faithfuls as Jen walks in. Now Jen doesn't go into details, but she tries to warn Emmeline that this isn't Lila, but Emmeline knows, and she quickly realizes that this is the sister she's been admiring her whole time at the Sisterhood in Mother Dorotea. Now after looking up the information, she learns that her followers are no longer around and they're actually been erased from the records by Valia. Which, speaking of, we see Valia and Francesca as she explains in a very kind of Mission Impossible type of way, where she's explaining the plan to her, and as an audience we're watching the plan as it shakes out. Now the plan is to have Valia get arrested in order to free Nez, and Theodosia's going to help by using her face dancing skills. Now Francesca sees the weapon that's going to be used to kill the Emperor, as it's coated with metacyanine, which will be a quick and painless death, and of course she's tasked to doing this job, as she states, Sisterhood above all. Now again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, and we'll talk about this more in detail a little bit later, but notice every time they say Sisterhood above all is when they're about to kill somebody. Now the weapon that's referred to in that previous scene will later be called the Gom Jabbar, as is known as the high-handed enemy, which happens to be the name of this episode, and as you would imagine, it is a handheld needle tapped with the metacyanine poisoning. As you all will remember the famous scene in Dune with Paul Atreides being introduced to this very needle. Now back with Hart, which by the way, the silver case that I have on the screen now, anyone in the comments know if this has any significance to Hart? Have we seen him use this before and I'm just not remembering it? Let me know in the comments below, but we have the Emperor confronting him about his involvement of his daughter's recent arrest. Now Hart explains to the Emperor that he should discuss this with his wife because she was the one that made the decision, but Nez was the one who ultimately tried to free the traitor of the Imperium. Now, of course, the Emperor doesn't want to believe these actions of her daughter, but he mentions to Hart that he's actually going to be sending his wife, the Empress, to be sent away on this tour of goodwill on the behalf of the Imperium. Now, Hart immediately calls the Emperor out on this, knowing that the Emperor just wants to spend more time with Francesca. As Hart tells the Emperor about the sister's involvement in his assassination attempt with Francesca's knowledge, but again, the Emperor refuses to acknowledge Hart's admissions. Now, the Emperor takes this opportunity to remind Hart of his complicated relationship with Mother Superior, and he's considering bringing her back into the fold. And I know this show is very serious, there's not a lot of levity, but I personally was laughing so hard at seeing Hart's reaction to the Emperor telling him this, because as he's putting his head in his hands, I just know he wanted to curse out the Emperor and call him every name in the book. But ultimately, we see Hart takes this as the Emperor choosing Valia's advice over his, which after everything he's done, we see just how upset this made Hart, and we know that after what happened in the last episode in the final scene with him and the Empress, this kind of pushed Hart on the edge to really join forces with her. Now next we see the Empress has already learned of what the Emperor has planned for her. She tells her husband that that won't be happening as Hart appears in the room. Now Hart shows the Emperor where his loyalty now lies, as the Emperor is flabbergasted as his wife tells him that he will remain Emperor, but he will no longer ignore her and basically serve as her puppet. Obviously, we know as an audience the Emperor has been used as a puppet for so long for others, but for the character, this is his first time fully being aware of it. Cut to Valia entering the throne room as we see the Emperor outside catching his breath after the recent encounter as he learns that Mother Superior has arrived. Now he walks into the throne room to finding Valia sitting on his throne as she tells him that she's here to clarify their positions. First and foremost, Valia on the throne, very, very bold move. But surprisingly, the Emperor is so happy to see her. He tells her that he needs her help and he wants Heart to be removed and he wants to go back to their old arrangement and he doesn't want to be a puppet to his wife and Heart. I just really love this scene and I love this moment because we see some personality in the older version of Valia, which we really haven't seen in this series so far, but she doesn't seem like the person that is going to like to rebuild a broken trust or broken bridges made, as she proceeds to tell him just exactly what's been going on. Valia tells the Emperor that he has never been free and calls him weak, and she reveals that his entire life has basically been scripted by the Sisterhood before he was even born. He's made no major decisions in his life, and he's basically just an assignment. Now she goes even further and reveals the fact that Francesca never loved him and it's his daughter that's of the utmost importance, not him, and his time is up. Now clearly this upsets the Emperor and he instructs his guards to arrest her, and immediately you notice the guards kind of hesitate because it's almost as though they don't even trust the Emperor's own orders in the moment. Now at first I was thinking to myself, is this some type of Sisterhood mind trick like reverse psychology? But then I quickly remembered this is all a part of Valia's plan to get arrested so she can get Nez. Now realistically, Valia could have maybe said like half of those nasty things to get herself arrested, but I am to believe that she added those more personal touches as like a punishment to remind him that she's in charge, but to also, Valia seems to be a very petty person. She did this like in a form of payback for him betraying her and choosing Heart over her, as the sisters' knife cuts very deep, but their truths behind their words cut even deeper. Now back at the Sisterhood, as Dorotea walks in the garden area, she starts to recall where she died and she slowly begins to replay that night as she had the voice being used on her by Valia. Now, fueled by anger, and rightfully so, we see Dorotea shows them the truth about who their Mother Superior Valia really is, as she breaks into one of the exterior walls to remove the water in a well to reveal the truth. Now, we'll be discussing what's discovered here in a second, but I want you all to remember, and this goes back to a callback of episode 4, when the sisters began drawing their nightmares, their shared nightmares, you'll recall that some of the sisters drew a well, and somebody drew someone falling, as we find out exactly what Dorotea is about to show them and showing the connections of what that drawing meant and how it's now coming to fruition. Now here we cut to another flashback where Valia tells Dorotea's followers what really happened to her. Now most of them are immediately seeing that this is being a lie being told to them by Valia, as we see Valia and the sisters try to convince them at first with a more reasonable approach, but it unfortunately fails. Now in response, Valia takes a more aggressive approach by having them choose between life and joining together as sisters or death. As we watch Valia, Francesca, and Kasha, who now know how to use the voice, they make Dorotea's followers choose, as we watch them cut their own throats as a way of picking their choice. And at the last minute, we see Tula eventually joins. Now the only one to survive this is Sister Avila, who vows to never reveal this secret. Now to me, her surviving speaks so much volumes to her never taking the agony to actually become a mother. Sister Avila most likely lost her faith in the Sisterhood with Valia leading the Sisterhood, and probably couldn't leave because Valia would most likely kill her in fear that she's going to reveal her secret. It's almost like she was a prisoner in the Sisterhood for all these years. In this moment, it really makes you kind of rethink about Sister Avila. To me personally, she was someone that came off like a hater and someone that I really wasn't a fan of, but now having seen this flashback, it just adds so much context to her character. Now, I can't go without talking about that moment. That just completely caught me off left field. Like, my goodness, what an extremely dark and terrifying moment. They literally killed the sisters and really started from scratch after this. Now, I am very curious to know if this is something that might be explored in season 2, but it appears that once you pledge to be a sister, you leave everything behind, including your family, and you may never speak to them again or hear from them again. But again, I am curious to know if any one of those murdered sisters' family members have ever reached out, and if so, could they be looking for answers to what happened to their daughters? But again, this reveal just adds so much context to characters. Just thinking about Dorotea and like how she never got past what happened to her. And I mean, you know why, even in death, because this whole sisterhood was built and operated on one thing, and that is them being attacked by the idea of fear and being forged in bloodshed. And again, I just can't move past that scene because it was such a crazy reveal, but I feel like younger Valia is far more frightening than the older version of herself. I'm not saying in a negative way, I just really mean like the younger version of her is just terrifying. Now, I've said this before, that we were led to believe, at least 2 episodes in, that Tula was so kind, but obviously episode 3 changed that and really showed her true colors, and she even speaks to that later in this finale. But now seeing Kasha and Francesca, again, characters that I'm just going to speak for myself, I thought they were kind, I thought they were, level-headed individuals, but come to find out, they're just as brutal and vicious. And I want to be clear, they've made these violent decisions on their own, and they chose to go down that path, but it wasn't without the guidance of Valia. This was the moment I realized how this really puts a new context on the real meaning of the particular characters who have been saying this season, Sisterhood Above All. That meant something different to these 4 horsemen ladies, and their group was really the real sisterhood they've always spoke of. And these were the secrets that Tula spoke of all the way back in episode 2. After that death flashback, we cut to Francesca, who's awaiting the Emperor, who's upset about finding out what he just did from Valia. Now, he tells her what Valia told him, and in return, we get a surprise from her as she reveals the poison needle and basically says that it's Valia's plan, never hers, basically choosing him over the sisterhood. Now, from one character choosing love over the sisterhood, we cut to Kieran, who finds Nez is being held next to him as Valia arrives to release her. Now, Valia kills the guards with the help of Theodosia, who's now going to be covering as Nez with her shape-shifting abilities, as Nez refuses to leave without Kieran. Now, Theodosia will buy them some time, something I theorized in my last video as they make their escape plan. Now, I'm going to talk about this scene here for a second. This is an example to me of a little payoff that works from a few episodes back where Valia had planned for Theodosia and Nez to grow close together and become friends or whatnot. But this is an example to me of the lack of numbers of this episode, right? And maybe setting this moment up to have more of an impact. Now, what I mean by that is if we would have had more episodes to flesh out things like this, imagine if Nez and Theodosia really did have more time to develop more, and Nez thinking that she and Theodosia are becoming friends, all to learn in this scene that she's just been a part of a contingency plan, which in return could have opened Nez to seeing the true intentions of the sisterhood and how they really work. And again, this moment would have just been more impactful if we would have just had more time to flesh out that relationship. Now, during all this, we hear the Empress talking to Hart about their plans to accusing the sisterhood of attempting the assassination of an emperor, but in comes the guards to tell them about Valia's arrest. But again, this is very important because it's going to frame what the Empress does a little bit later. Now, as Hart instructs a full lockdown on the palace, he's stopped by an injured guard who's whispering something. Now, as he gets closer, he gets stabbed, and we know it's Theodosia who's taken that soldier's form. Now, Theodosia is knocked out, and she returns back to her normal form as Hart instructs the guards to put her in a holding cell, which is leaving her alive, which makes me so happy because I would love to explore more of her species, but also seeing more face dancers come season 2. Now, back with Francesca and the Emperor, he draws a knife on her, not believing that she's on his side. Now, she tells him that the imprint won't allow him to harm her as she tries to de-escalate the situation, but instead he tells her that it's kind of strange, this thing that's going on right now, to him realizing that he's really never experienced a really true moment of freedom. But now is his time to make a change and to make a decision of his own as we see him stab himself. Yet another crazy reveal that I did not anticipate happening, the Emperor taking his own life, and it just speaks so much to the character. After learning that he had no idea his life was completely orchestrated and planned out with his knowledge, he would rather die than to be a part of this falsehood. Now again, rest in peace to the Emperor, man. I did not anticipate that happening, but despite the lack of authority and him being a weak man and a weak leader overall as an emperor, I couldn't help but to think about the similarities of his story and how it kind of reminds me of the same one of House of the Dragon, and I'm referring to King Viserys Targaryen. Again, if you've seen that show, you can see the similarities of these men who are just kind of weak, but behind that is most likely a good person put in a bad situation. They both were manipulated and betrayed by those that they thought that they can trust. Now, let's talk about this briefly in the comments below. Personally, I feel bad for the Emperor, but let me know how you all feel. Do you feel bad? Do you not care? Let's have that conversation in the comment section. Now, going back to the scene, as the Emperor slowly dies, as Francesca begs for him to stay with her, in comes the jealous Empress, who takes the needle and uses it on Francesca as she watches her husband and the mistress both die on top of each other. Now, going back to that scene that I mentioned earlier with the Emperor's plan, Well, she takes this opportunity as she begins screaming that the Emperor has been killed, and it's pretty safe to assume that she's going to now blame Francesca of the murder of the Emperor, and it was on the behalf of the Sisterhood. Now, speaking about things I didn't anticipate in this finale, I did not expect to see both of these characters dying in the finale. What a major plot to build on for next season. Will other royal families immediately lock up or maybe kill their truthsayers in fear of their lives? What will Constantine do once he learns that both of his parents are now dead? How will the Sisterhood prove their innocence in all this? Even though the Emperor dying was Valia's intentions, I guess the Sisterhoods could say that that was part of her plan. They had nothing to do with that. But more importantly, who will now sit on the throne? Now, going back to the Sisterhood, Dorotea unearths the truth by showing the sisters the remains of the fallen sisters that we saw forced to choose their life, and now they're just skeletons that were thrown away like trash, as she tells them that Valia murdered them. Now, Jen tells Sister Avila to tell Tula about this, but we know she knows Tula was a part of this, as she has Mother Dorotea leading the way to return the sisters back to their righteous path, as she leads them to the breeding archives to show them just how deep this corruption goes, as we watch Dorotea destroys the thinking machine and destroying her grandmother's life's work. Now, we don't see any more of the Sisterhood for the rest of this episode, but I want to briefly talk about them here for a second. This was easily the most interested I've personally been in this subplot. I'm not saying it was bad or terrible, but it definitely was lower on my personal interest of this show, and I believe it was mostly highlighted this week because, like last week, we have more of Lila, and to me, she's truly the strongest amongst the younger actors in this show, and particularly in those scenes, and just really shifted the tone and the direction of the show. And I thought that she did such a great job in this particular episode, and just across the board, I thought that this particular subplot just really worked for me in this finale. Now, we flash back to Tula recently having given birth to Hart as she makes her tough choice. She knows her sister will only use him as a tool and a weapon once he comes of age, so Tula gives him the freedom of not being a victim of the Sisterhood. Now, we come to find out that Francesca actually played a role in this plan, which goes to show that she actually didn't completely always agree with Valia, kept things like this from her, and it kind of speaks to the adult version of Francesca going against Valia by picking the Emperor over killing him, as Francesca brought a stillborn baby to replace Hart to make Valia believe that the baby didn't make it after the pregnancy, as we watch her make the exchange and hold the stillborn in her arms. Now, I gotta point this out, man, this is some really good emotional stuff in this moment, but I also want to speak about this maybe being explored further in a season 2. The story goes that Francesca found this woman who was expecting to have a stillborn, and in exchange they were going to give obviously the stillborn to Francesca so they can make the exchange with Desmond Hart. And it was said that the woman has kind eyes, right? She said that she was kind, but she specifically said that she had kind eyes. Now, we know the importance of eyes throughout this entire series. It's very, very important to the show. The way that they use that, like, why does she have to say she had, I know that's like a gesture that people say they have kind eyes, indicating they're a kind person. But again, knowing the significance of how eyes play a part in this series, I wonder if we'll learn who raised Hart, if there's anything to do with him being who he becomes in the show, because we know Hart says that he came from a place where it was like scavengers, he had to fight for his life. But again, I'm very curious to know, who was his mother? Was there a father involved? Are they still alive? And again, are they responsible for who Hart becomes in this show? Now, something else I want to point out in this scene, I could be mistaken, but you notice how baby Hart was covered in that black blanket, or like that cloth that was in all black? I wonder if some of that black material is the same one we see him holding closely in what seems to be something he cherished, like in a form of a remembrance of his childhood, as we saw him holding. It was in the very first scene that we saw him being introduced in episode 1, and we also saw him using it in episode 5. But going back to the decision that we saw Tula making, it really does put a new perspective on the character in a sense of like how she saw Lila, a child that was parentless, and she wanted to take care of her, which was something she wasn't able to do with her own child that she had to abandon to protect him from her sister. As we cut back to present day, as we see Tula entering the atmosphere to go see her son. Now, this was a brief scene, but this was a scene that definitely sets up something more for season 2. And yet again, a theory that I had predicted as we cut to seeing Harrow, who is now being revealed to have been spying on Valia in her private meetings with the technology that Hart gave him back in episode 5 as a gift. As is revealed that he recorded the entire conversation, which entailed the entire plan with how they're going to kill the Emperor and Nez's escape plan. Which to me goes back to what Karen said earlier in the episode, proving that you really can't trust a Harkonnen. Now my question is, did he do this on his own, having like his own contingency plan or like a way of blackmailing Valia, or is this him choosing a side? Did he choose the Empress and Hart and portraying his aunt? Again, another plot that I'm very interested in seeing being fleshed out more in season 2. Now back with Valia, Karen, and Nez, they land at a fuel station as Valia will buy them some time for Karen to take Nez to safety as we get to see the Mother Superior in action. As the soldiers draw their swords, we see Valia kills one, has another defend her by killing one of their own, and instructs the others to kill Hart. Which I gotta say, this just goes to show how powerful sisters can be and how they can use the voice. Really badass scene to me. But even though he was wounded, we watch Hart, he's still able to handle his own as he kills the soldiers, leaving a face-off between Hart and Valia. Now Valia tells him to show her the end that he spoke of about her as he listens and shows her by using his abilities as we see a thumper on Arrakis as they both fall to their knees. Now cut to Valia experiencing her nightmare, which takes her back to Lincolnville, her home planet, to the time that Griffin was drowning as we see her screaming for him to swim. Now meanwhile we see Tula arrive and she sees both Kieran and Nez on the run, but her inner thoughts, the foremothers, tell her that that's the workings of her sister Valia's influence and that she should let them pass and go find her sister Valia. Now we do get another action scene, which I did enjoy the action in this finale as we see Nez using those skills that she learned from Karen as they're going back to back, taking out the soldiers as they will be patiently awaiting Valia to meet them at the rendezvous. Back with Tula, she finds her sister and tells her that she can't fight this because it's a machine, as we see this look of concern on her face because she also sees that her wounded son is on the floor. Now this nightmare of Valia is having all stems from fear of being back at home but also losing Griffin, as Tula tries to bring her back like she did when she took the agony, and just like that time, she does bring her back by telling her that she has to let the fear go and tonight fight back against the machine. Before getting out of this nightmare, we see she gets a message from her brother who tells her that she is responsible for killing him and she's going to kill them all, which can be foreshadowing for next season. Now Valia comes face to face with the worm as she's taken to Arrakis as it approaches and consumes her into the blue light. By the way, incredible work by the visual department's team. Like, this entire scene was like visually very impressive. But now is the moment where we finally figure out what the blue glowing eyes mean. So we cut to seeing Hart's point of view as he's awakened on this operational table to a thinking machine with, here we go, the blue lights at the center of it as it's performing the procedure to implant the nanoscale virus into Hart's eye as we watch him seize that someone's watching him, which again speaks to those nightmares about someone's watching. It's the eyes, the blue light, it's all being explained. Now, honestly, I thought that the show, once they announced the season 2 before the finale happened, I thought that this was going to be held to be explained in season 2. But again, we finally understand why Hart and all the victims in the nightmares saw the same thing. It was, again, Hart, what he saw in his operation. Now, of course, there is plenty of unanswered questions surrounding this whole procedures, like the details involving including who explained to Hart just how to use the virus. But the one biggest question is, we don't see who found him and used him as the bioweapon. Now, based on the unfocused viewpoint of Hart during this scene, we can definitely see that there is a person there and they are standing in front of an orange light behind them, which basically to me indicates that they're on the planet of Arrakis, as we know that he was consumed by the worm on Arrakis, so it makes sense that they're still on Arrakis, but it looks like they have a hood on. Now, is this a similar design as far as clothing to the Sisterhood's hood? Could be, but I don't think it's a sister. I'm still very much in the belief, if you see my videos these past 6 weeks, that Vorian Atreides is 100% still alive, and or it could be Albert Atreides, or maybe both of them. But again, I feel confident that Vorian will be a part of season 2, and he will be like a driving force of season 2, either Vorian or Albert Atreides or both. They are maybe, I'm 99% sure that they are the ones behind creating or resurrecting Desmond Hart. Now back with the sisters, Valia tells Tula what she saw and how she couldn't make out who's behind this, but knows that the virus is in Hart's eye and she's prepared to cut it out. But Mother Tula steps in, stops her sister by using a voice on her, something that I would imagine Valia has never experienced before. Now here's what Tula reveals that Hart is her son. Valia, of course, feels betrayed, and she was under the impression that the baby was stillborn from the flashback that we saw, as Tula explains that she had to protect him from her. Now, Tula admits that they are two of the same. They're two wolves born to feed, no matter at the cost. Now, to briefly reflect on this moment and knowing how things played out in the flashbacks, I do think that Valia is definitely hurt by this idea that Tula thought less of her and that she would have taken advantage of her baby. Now, personally, I'm like 90% sure that Tula made the right decision in giving up her child, because I do think Valia would have used Hart when he became like the right age. But that other like 10% of me, is there a possibility that she could have just like loved the child as a nephew and just raised him normally? Again, we'll never know. But again, he's family. So again, she seems to treat certain family members like Tula and Griffin like she loves them. Let me know in the comments below what could have happened. Do you all think that Valia would have used Hart as a child or once he came of age? Or do you think she would have been a nice auntie to her nephew and raised him just to be normal? Let me know your thoughts about that in the comments below. Now, Valia points out the fact that their enemies saw Hart's potential and the machine saw this and harnessed his abilities, as Valia wants to put an end to this and put an end to him, but Tula knows he's a victim and wants her sister to allow her to save her son and fix this if she'll trust her to do so. Now we watch as Valia withdraws her blade. She didn't kill either Tula or her nephew Hart, and she allows Tula to do as she wishes, but she reminds her that the reckoning is still coming. Valia is very aware of this new hand in the game and heads off to find them scheming in the shadows. Now during this whole confrontation, we know Hart heard all of this. He now knows who his mother is, and initially when Tula's going in for a hug, we see him kind of like being resistant, but he does embrace his mother for the very first time, and we see this really nice cutscene here when she sees him as a little boy again, and she remembers that time that she gave him the freedom, and unfortunately this turned against her, because knowing that she is his mother, this doesn't stop him from having her get arrested. Which to me, this sets up, obviously we know Theodosia is going to be in the prison cell, and I would imagine Theodosia and Tula will be in the same holding cell. Potentially they can maybe separate them, but this also sets up the inevitable conversation between mother and son. Going back to the actual scene, I thought there were some great performances by that trio of actors in that moment. Like, I really felt the sisters back and forth, and I really did feel the emotions between Tula and her son Desmond Hart. As we end this finale in space, where we find a ship headed into Arrakis, and again, shout out to the production of the show, because this, I know some people complain that it doesn't feel like the world of Dune, and of course, you know, Denis Villeneuve, they have a much bigger budget than the show had, but when we go to Arrakis, it looked like the Arrakis from the films, obviously 10,000 years into the past, but it looked really clean, and very curious to know like the production going from all these different planets of, you know, Lankaville and the capital, but now they're going to be maybe mainly on Arrakis come season 2, but nonetheless, very impressed by the production team and the scouting team of finding this location. As they land, we see Valia, Kieran, and Nez, which by the way, a Harkonnen, an Atreides, and a Carino, all working together, as this is the path to finding their enemy. Man, what a massive episode. So let's wrap this thing up, because I am very thirsty, like I'm on Arrakis. But anyway, thoughts on the episode. Getting the negatives out of the way first, and I'm going to be honest with you all, I'm not saying this was flawless, I'm not saying this is perfect television, but considering the announcement of season 2 earlier in the week, I feel as though that we got the answer that we needed, but at the same time, they set up a lot of things to be explored in season 2. I really don't have many flaws in this episode. Like, this felt like I was watching a Dune movie. Like, this was almost an hour and a half. It was epic, it was emotional, it was surprising, it was shocking, and again, it sets up things like the Sisterhood now being under this new leadership of Dorotea, but Lila's still inside, and I believe Jin's going to be the one to maybe bring her out, but I do do feel like though Dorotea is going to be like mainly using Lila for most of season 2, if not all of season 2 potentially. But again, season 2 also sets up one of the biggest issues with the Sisterhood is they no longer have thinking technology to their accessibility. Of course, we know that the sisters still use this breeding system in the future, but what's going to happen now as far as how they're going to operate and what's going to happen in regards to how they're going to be moving forward with the new leader of Dorotea? Of course, we have an emperor who's now dead, so Ned's no longer in line of the empress. Constantine commanding the flight, like what's going to happen with him? It's safe to assume that Natalia will be sitting on a throne and Hart by her side. And of course, you can't forget about characters like Theodosia, who is now going to be with Tula, and they're going to probably be working together. And of course, she's going to try to reconnect with her son. We have Michaela, who's still out there somewhere. And of course, we have to find out who's the enemy that created Hart. All things that I am excited to explore in season 2, on top of learning new characters, you know, Gulas and all the different lore and the mythology in Dune. So I'm really excited about season 2. So overall, I've seen and heard the dislikes of people that are, I'm not trying to put people in a box, but I've seen a lot of the criticism come from people that have read the books and they feel like the show didn't do the books justice. And again, I get how some people come from that perspective. Like there's certain things that I'm connected to from like a comic book perspective, and when I see a film or a show that doesn't really as faithful to the source material, it can be frustrating. But again, from someone that hasn't read the books, but from someone that's watched the films, loves the films, and I've done, you know, research of the Dune universe, I'm just speaking to my experience. I really enjoyed this show. Like I had such a fun time exploring more of this world and these characters, and I was so fascinating with the Bene Gesserit in the Dune films, but now to get this perspective of their origins and their sisterhood, again, I thoroughly enjoyed this series. Yes, I wish we had more episodes to spend time fleshing out characters and relationships. For example, I've said it before, and I felt like the acolytes and the sisters, like the whole training subplot, wasn't as strong for me, besides the incredible performance by Chloe Lee as Sister Lila. But I also didn't think the love story between Nez and Karen was as strong as the show wants us to believe. And that's just me personally. But again, the positives of the actual main story outweighed the negatives in my opinion. And the main story being the story of the Harkonnen sisters, Valia and Tula. And I mean both version of the characters. And again, not to compare this to House of the Dragon, but there's a lot of similarities to me, even though I know Dune came before this. But I think about young Rhaenyra and Alicent and like how the young actors were just as good as the older actors and they complemented each other. Same could be said about this show. The younger versions of Valia and Tula and the older versions, they were just such on the same page. It was like a symbiotic relationship. I felt the performance. I loved the details of the character development throughout the entire series from both sets of characters. And while their actions were nothing short of villainous, I think it's more than just black and white. Both characters definitely played in the gray, and while I don't condone their actions, I think the show did a really great job of exploring the reasons behind their decisions that they made throughout this season. Again, this felt like Dune to me, but of course from another perspective, and from my experience with the films that I love so near and dear, I thought the 6 episodes of the show has really grown to really be something I enjoyed, and I'm beyond excited to see season 2 has in store. Now the question is, which comes first, season 2 or Dune Messiah? Let me know your thoughts and predictions on that in the comments below. So before I wrap up, I have maybe 1 or 2 more videos coming as it pertains to this show before we officially retire, before getting the news of season 2. So make sure to keep an eye out for those videos coming soon. But with that being said, thank you all for watching this massive video. Like, I don't know what's the length of this video before I edit it all out. But if you watch it from beginning to the end, I really appreciate you. But also, I want to take the time to thank everyone that's been watching these videos since, episode 1. I know there are some great content creators out there, people that are much more versed in the Dune universe that covers this show. So the fact that you all have been watching my videos, whether it's from day 1 or this is your first time watching the video, I really do want to take the time to thank you. So please leave all your thoughts, opinions, theories, deeper meanings, and everything you all took away from this episode. And of course, let me know your overall thoughts of the season, favorite episode, favorite character, things that worked, things that didn't work. And of course, what do you all hope to see in season 2? Please support this video by liking the video, sharing this video, but more importantly, consider sticking around by subscribing to the channel and hitting that bell notification. Don't forget, you all are awesome, stay safe, and I'll catch you all on the next breakdown.